Path of Exile 2 is a game that has spent years building a world most players will never fully see, and this video exists because that world deserves someone to sit with it properly. There is a particular kind of game lore that functions almost like background radiation. It is everywhere, shaping the tone of every room and every line of dialogue, but it does not demand your attention directly. It allows itself to be overlooked. Path of Exile is that kind of game, and its sequel takes the same approach and deepens it, adds new continents and new civilizations and new theological catastrophes, and then distributes the evidence across item flavor text and environmental storytelling, and the idle observations of characters you pass once and never speak to again. I spent a significant amount of time with this material before I started writing, and the choice I made when assembling this script was to prioritize the lore of each class as it intersects with the world's broader history, rather than treating each class in isolation. There is a version of this video that covers each character's mechanics and then gestures vaguely at their backstory. This is not that version. What I found when I spent time with the source material was that the classes in Path of Exile 2 are not really independent character archetypes. They are positions within a specific historical moment, each one arriving at the threshold of Wraeclast, carrying a different relationship to the forces that destroyed it. Understanding why the warrior is a warrior requires understanding what the Vaal left behind. Understanding why the Sorceress is a sorceress requires knowing what the Eternal Empire did with knowledge it should not have had. The classes are answers to questions the world is still asking. So that is the shape this video takes. Before I move forward, I want to ask you to support this channel by clicking that subscribe button if you have not already. These videos take a long time to make, and they reach people who actually want to sit with this material in full. And the only way that keeps happening is if the channel grows. So if you find this useful, that one small thing makes a real difference. Wraeclast. The name itself carries a particular weight in the context of the game's world, though the game does not explain that weight immediately. It arrives as geography, as a destination, as a place where exiles are sent to die. But the name is not incidental. It suggests something broken and something cold, and the game confirms both eventually. This is a continent that was once the center of not one but several successive civilizations, each of which reached toward a kind of power it could not responsibly hold, and each of which collapsed in a way that left the wreckage embedded in the landscape like shrapnel. The world of Path of Exile 2 does not treat this as metaphor. It treats it as literal archaeology. You walk through those ruins. You read what they left behind. The earliest civilization the game acknowledges with any real depth is the Vaal. They are not the beginning of Wraeclast's story, but they are the deepest layer that the current surface sits above, and their shadow falls on nearly everything that came after them. The Vaal were a civilization defined by a particular appetite, which was the appetite for power through sacrifice. Not sacrifice in the symbolic sense that most fantasy cultures use, where the word gets attached to rituals that have long since stopped meaning what they once meant. The Vaal practiced sacrifice in the most direct and transactional sense possible. They gave things of genuine value to forces that accepted genuine value, and in return, those forces gave them access to a kind of magic that the game calls Vaal corruption. The specific nature of those forces is something the game is carefully ambiguous about. It suggests demonic origin in some places and something stranger in others. And one possible reading of the Vaal's theology is that they were not worshipping demons at all, but rather conducting a long experiment in applied metaphysics that happened to require an enormous amount of blood. What the Vaal built with this power was extraordinary. Their architecture still stands across Wraeclast, not because it was built to last, but because the magic that went into its construction left it in a kind of suspended state, resistant to the ordinary decay that takes everything else. You walk through Vaal ruins and Path of Exile, and you understand immediately that these were not humble structures. They were designed to be overwhelming, to communicate scale and intention, and a willingness to commit enormous resources to a single purpose. The purpose shifts depending on which part of the ruins you are in. Some were temples of a straightforward kind. Others were laboratories. Others were something in between, structures whose architecture does not map cleanly onto any single function. As if the Vaal did not recognize a meaningful distinction between worship and research. The Vaal gem system is one of the most interesting pieces of lore in the game, partly because it functions simultaneously as a gameplay mechanic and as a record of how this civilization chose to preserve its knowledge. Vaal gems are ordinary skill gems that have been corrupted, which means in practical terms that they have been touched by a force that the game associates specifically with the Vaal's manner of accessing power. The skills they produce are stronger in some cases, stranger in others, and they require souls to activate. This is not flavor. The game takes the soul requirement seriously as a piece of world building, and it points towards something worth noticing. The Vaal did not consider souls to be categorically different from other resources. They were material. They could be collected and spent. The implications of this for Vaal society, for what it meant to live among a civilization that held this view, are not spelled out in detail. They are left in the ruins. The Vaal civilization ended. The circumstances of that ending are one of the more genuinely contested pieces of lore in the Path of Exile community, partly because the game itself is not fully committed to a single explanation. What is agreed upon is that the ending was cataclysmic and essentially total. The Vaal did not decline. They did not migrate or transform into something else. They collapsed, quickly and catastrophically. And the event that caused this collapse is referred to in the game as the Vaal Cataclysm. The nature of that event involves a figure named Doriani, who is perhaps the most significant single character in the game's deep history. Not because he is heroic or villainous in any clean sense, but because he is the person most clearly responsible for what came next. He is the Vaal's chief architect of a particular experiment. And the experiment went wrong in a way that took the civilization with it. Doriani's specific transgression, as the game presents it, involved reaching through the barrier that separates the ordinary world from whatever lies beyond it, which the game calls the void in some contexts and frames differently in others, in making contact with something that should not have been contactable. The result of that contact was not immediate destruction. It was a corruption that spread through the Vaal's already corrupted infrastructure and eventually became self-sustaining. The Vaal had spent generations building a civilization on the deliberate use of corrupting power. Doriani's experiment did not introduce corruption into a clean system. It introduced a quantity and quality of corruption that overwhelmed a system that had been managing corruption as a controlled variable. The distinction matters because it means the Vaal's ending was not a divine punishment for hubris in the theatrical sense. It was an engineering failure at civilizational scale. What survived the Vaal cataclysm is strange and worth dwelling on. The ruins survived. Some of the gems survived. Some of the entities the Vaal had summoned or created or bargained with survived in forms that the later civilizations would encounter and mostly failed to understand. And certain people survived, not many, and not in great shape, but enough to carry something of the Vaal's approach to power forward into whatever came next. The game suggests rather than states that some of the Vaal's surviving descendants, or people who came into contact with Vaal artifacts, carried a particular orientation toward magic that would eventually surface again in the civilizations that followed. The Eternal Empire, which came much later, shows signs of this inheritance, not in its architecture or its explicit theology, but in certain corners of its scholarship, and in the specific manner in which its most ambitious practitioners eventually destroy themselves. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Vaal ruins scattered throughout Act 2 of Path of Exile, and notice that their internal organization suggests a distinction between two kinds of spaces. There are the ceremonial areas, which are large and ornate and designed for crowds. And there are the working areas, which are smaller and more functional and carry a different kind of residual energy. The game does not label these spaces or explain the distinction directly, but the visual language is consistent enough that it suggests the Vaal maintained a separation between the public performance of their power and the private practice of it. What happens in the ceremonial spaces is visible and shared. What happens in the working spaces was, apparently, for fewer eyes. That separation is itself a piece of information about how the Vaal thought about what they were doing. The Eternal Empire is the civilization that occupies the middle of Wraeclast's historical timeline, and it is the one whose shadow falls most directly on Path of Exile 2's narrative, because the events that create the game's current crisis are deeply rooted in what the Eternal Empire chose to do with the world it inherited from the Vaal. The Eternal Empire was a human civilization in the sense that the Vaal were not quite human, or at least were human in a way that had drifted far enough from recognizable humanity that the distinction matters. The Eternal Empire built roads and administered provinces and developed legal systems and engaged in trade. It was an empire in the most conventional sense. And it also eventually developed a relationship with a particular kind of power that it borrowed, consciously or not, from the civilization whose ruins it built on top of. The emperor at the center of the Eternal Empire's story is Chittis, though the game is careful to distribute its attention across several emperors, because the problem the Eternal Empire represents is not the problem of one bad ruler, but the problem of an institution that moved in a particular direction across generations. Chittis is significant because of what he commissioned, which was a research project into the nature of immortality. The Eternal Empire under Chittis developed a technology, if you can call it that, for transferring human consciousness between bodies. They called it Eternal, and the ambition behind it was exactly what it sounds like: the preservation of self across the death of any particular physical form. This is not a small ambition. This is the ambition that, once you take it seriously, requires you to re-examine every other value you hold, because if physical death is solved, then most of the moral frameworks humans have developed to deal with physical death become obsolete overnight. The Eternal Empire did not solve immortality cleanly. The Eternal technology worked in certain narrow and specific ways and failed in others, and the failures were the ones that mattered in the long run. What the game establishes is that the process of achieving eternal status, of undergoing the ritual that made it possible, was not something available to everyone. It required resources, it required specific knowledge, and it required a relationship with a source of power that the Eternal Empire scholars located in the same general neighborhood as the force the Vaal had been working with. Not identical, the game is careful about this, but adjacent. Close enough that the Eternal Empire's experiments with immortality carried within them the same structural risk that the Vaal's experiments with corruption had carried, which was the risk of opening a channel to something that did not have the civilization's best interests in mind. The God Emperor Chittis eventually became one of the most powerful figures in Wraeclast's history, and also one of the most destructive, and the relationship between those two facts is not coincidental. The more power the Eternal Empire accumulated through its immortality research, the more it attracted attention from forces that were themselves interested in accumulating power. The game's pantheon, which is one of the more carefully developed pieces of its theology, includes entities that existed before the Eternal Empire, and will presumably exist after whatever comes next. Several of them intersected with the Eternal Empire during its peak, and not all of those intersections were beneficial. The God Emperor's specific relationship with the entity that would eventually be identified as the source of much of Wraeclast's current corruption is one of the game's central mysteries. And the answer the game offers is oblique enough that different readers come away with genuinely different understandings of what happened. What is clear is that the Eternal Empire fell, in that its fall was not as sudden or as total as the Val's. The Eternal Empire did not collapse in a cataclysm. It decayed. It fragmented. The provinces that had been held together by the authority of the God Emperor and by the network of immortal servants who administered them began to pull apart when those immortal servants started behaving in ways that suggested their immortality had not left their judgment intact. There is a piece of lore in the original game, delivered through one of its most memorable characters, that describes what long-term eternal status does to a person. It does not preserve them cleanly. It preserves the form while something underneath changes. And what changes is not always something the person in question notices, because the thing doing the changing is also, by this point, doing some of the thinking. Path of Exile 2 inherits this history, and adds a new layer on top of it. The game takes place in Wraeclast 2 decades after the events of the first game, in a timeline where some of what was broken has been partially mended, and much of what was mended has broken again in different ways. The continent of Wraeclast is still full of ruins. The forces that the Val and the Eternal Empire unleashed are still present in the landscape. The entities that took an interest in Wraeclast's civilizations have not lost that interest. And into this landscape, new exiles are sent. New characters with new histories and new relationships to the powers that shaped this world. The 6 base classes of Path of Exile 2 are 6 different answers to the question of what kind of person arrives in this place and decides, for whatever reason, to walk into the ruins rather than away from them. The structure of the classes in Path of Exile 2 follows a pattern the original game established. Each base class has 2 ascendancy paths, which represent a deeper commitment to a specific aspect of the base class's power. The ascendancies are not just mechanical extensions. They are, in most cases, ideological positions. The choice between one ascendancy and another represents something about how a character understands the power they are using and what they are willing to do with it. The game does not always make this explicit. It often leaves the ideological content of an ascendancy choice embedded in item descriptions and NPC dialogue, and the specific nature of the skills each ascendancy unlocks. But it is there, and it is worth paying attention to, because the ascendancy paths are where the classes get interesting. The base classes establish what kind of person you are. The ascendancies establish what kind of person you are becoming. The decision to cover the classes in the order I chose, which moves from the warrior through the ranger through the sorceress and then the monk before reaching the mercenary and the huntress, was not alphabetical and not arbitrary. It follows a rough arc from the most physically grounded characters to the most cosmologically connected ones, from the classes whose power comes most directly from the body, and its capacities to the classes whose power comes from sources that are further from the human and closer to the forces that shaped this world. The warrior hits things. The huntress, by the end of her story, is doing something considerably stranger than hitting things. That arc is legible in the material, and covering the classes in this order allows the lore of the world to unfold in layers, each class adding context that makes the next one more interesting than it would be in isolation. The 6 classes also represent 6 different relationships to exile itself. Exile is not a neutral word in this game. To be exiled is to be cast out, to be stripped of whatever standing you had in the world that sent you away. But the circumstances of each class's exile are different, and those circumstances are not just biographical details. They are the specific ways the world has already shaped each character before the game begins. The warrior was not exiled for the same reason the sorceress was, and the mercenary's relationship to the institution of exile is different from both of them. These differences matter because they determine what each character is trying to recover or escape from, and that in turn shapes how they engage with the powers they encounter in Wraeclast. There is something interesting about the timing of Path of Exile 2 in relation to the first game's events. The original game ended, if you played through its full story, with the defeat of a specific kind of corruption and the promise of something like restoration. The world of Path of Exile 2 does not live up to that promise. The restoration was partial. Some of what was healed broke again, and some of what was expected to stay broken turned out to be more complicated than expected. Which is to say that some of the entities and forces that were supposedly defeated found ways to persist, or were never fully defeated in the first place, or were replaced by something that looked similar but was actually distinct. The game does not treat its own history as clean. That is one of the things that makes its lore genuinely interesting rather than merely extensive. The 6 base classes also differ in their relationship to the institutions of Wraeclast. Some of them come from within those institutions, from the military structures or scholarly orders or trading guilds that constitute the bones of the civilizations still functioning in this world. Others come from outside those institutions, from traditions that predate them or exist in parallel to them, or were specifically excluded from them. The monk, for example, comes from a tradition that has its own relationship to the divine, which is not the same as the Eternal Empire's relationship to the divine, and the distinction between those two things is significant. The Mercenary comes from a professional context that operates according to economic logic rather than ideological logic, and that too is significant because it means the Mercenary's relationship to power is fundamentally transactional in a way that the Warrior's is not. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the exile ships that bring characters to Wraeclast in both games, and notice that the game does not treat exile as a homogeneous experience. The original game's opening establishes exile as a death sentence rendered plausibly deniable. You are not being executed. You are being sent somewhere that will almost certainly kill you. And the distinction matters to the institution doing the sending, because it preserves a fiction about proportionality. Path of Exile 2 inherits this structure, but complicates it. The circumstances of exile in the second game involve a specific historical crisis, not just the ongoing administrative function of expelling inconvenient people. The exiles of Path of Exile 2 are arriving at a moment when Wraeclast itself is in the middle of something, and that something is going to require them to engage with the world's history in ways that the original game's exiles did not quite have to. The question of what Wraeclast wants from the people who arrive there is one that the game never answers directly, but it implies an answer throughout its environmental storytelling and its NPC dialogue. Wraeclast does not want anything in the way that a person wants something, but it has a kind of structural demand built into its history, which is that the things broken there require the kind of attention that only someone with nothing left to lose is willing to give them. Exiles have nothing left to lose. That is, in a sense, the definition of exile. And so there is a fitness between what Wraeclast needs and what the people sent to it carry with them that is not coincidental and is not really fate either. It is closer to the way that a particular kind of wound requires a particular kind of healer, not because fate has arranged it that way, but because the wound itself selects for whoever is willing to approach it without flinching. The lore of Path of Exile 2 also engages with a question that the original game raised, but did not fully answer, which is the question of what the gods of this world actually are. The game's pantheon is not composed of omnipotent beings in any straightforward theological sense. The gods of Wraeclast are powerful, yes, and they are ancient, and they have a relationship to the world's fundamental forces that gives them capacities beyond what any human could develop. But they are also wounded. They are limited. They have histories that include defeats and losses and transformations they did not choose. Several of them are in a state that could reasonably be described as diminishment, trapped or weakened or fragmented in ways that the events of the first game contributed to. The second game encounters them in this state and asks what it means to deal with beings that are simultaneously divine and damaged. The theological framework of Path of Exile is, if you sit with it long enough, one of the more interesting things about the game's world. It is not a world where the gods are simply beings to be defeated or worshipped. It is a world where the gods are participants in a longer story, where the relationship to the world's corruption and the world's civilizations has evolved across a timeline that predates human history. The game suggests, carefully and without overstating it, that the gods of Wraeclast may themselves be downstream of something older, that the forces the Vaal contacted, and the forces the Eternal Empire contacted, and the forces that the 6 classes of Path of Exile 2 will have to navigate, are all expressions of something that exists at a level below or beyond the individual divine personalities the game names. What that something is, the game does not say directly. It leaves the question open in a way that is either a deliberate choice or a future revelation. And either way, it means the lore remains generative even after you have spent a long time with it. The exiles of Path of Exile 2 arrive in this world at a moment of genuine crisis, which is not unusual for Wraeclast, but the specific nature of the current crisis is rooted in the gap between what the first game accomplished and what it failed to accomplish. The cure, if you want to call it that the original game's protagonists achieved was real, but partial. The corruption of Wraeclast was not eliminated. It was addressed at a specific level, in a specific form, and the forms it was not addressed in have continued to develop. Path of Exile 2 is the story of what happens next, which is to say it is the story of people encountering a wound that has been partially treated and discovering that the treatment introduced complications of its own. The 6 classes carry different pieces of this history with them, and the game distributes its exposition carefully across their origins and their dialogue and the specific nature of the powers they develop. No single class gets the whole picture. You need to sit with all of them, and with the world they move through, to assemble something like a coherent account of what is happening and why. That is the project of this video, and it is a project that requires patience, which is why this is not a 20-minute overview. The lore of Path of Exile 2 does not reward the 20-minute overview. It rewards the person who is willing to spend 8 hours sitting with it, and that is exactly what this is. The relationship between the base game of Path of Exile 2 and the original game's expanded content is something worth acknowledging before we move into the classes themselves. Path of Exile accumulated, across its years of operation, an enormous amount of additional lore through its league mechanics and expansions. Some of that lore is continuous with the core game's history. Some of it is more self-contained. The sequel builds on the core game's history and gestures towards some of the expanded content, but it does not treat all of it as equally canonical. The Vaal are core. The Eternal Empire is core. The specific events of certain leagues are referenced or implied, but not foregrounded. This script focuses on what the game treats as central to understanding the world, which means it emphasizes the deep history and the specific origins of each class, and it treats the more peripheral lore as context rather than as the main subject. What is interesting about the 6 classes of Path of Exile 2, considered from a slight distance, is that each one represents a particular strategy for surviving in a world that has already survived several catastrophes and is probably in the middle of another one. The warrior's strategy is physical dominance and structural resilience. The ranger's strategy is adaptability and precision. The sorceress's strategy is accumulated knowledge deployed with precision. The monk's strategy is discipline and a particular relationship to the divine that differs from anything the Eternal Empire developed. The mercenary's strategy is professional detachment and an understanding of systems. The huntress's strategy is something that takes longer to describe, because it involves a relationship to natural forces and ancestral powers that is itself complicated. Each of these strategies was developed in a specific cultural context, and that context is inseparable from what the strategy actually is. There is a recurring pattern in Path of Exile 2's class lore that is worth naming before we reach the individual classes. Each class has a relationship to a particular kind of power, And in each case, that relationship involves both the benefits and the costs of that power. And in each case, the costs are not external to the power, but intrinsic to it. The game does not present power as neutral. The corruption that Vol magic carries is not a bug that an improved version of the magic would eliminate. The instability that comes with manipulating the fundamental laws of the world, which is what certain forms of sorcery involve, is not a side effect that a skilled enough practitioner can avoid. The game treats power and its costs as a unified thing, and the classes embody this in their different ways. Understanding a class in full means understanding what it costs to be that class, not just what the class can do. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the ascendancy trials that players must complete to unlock each class's advanced paths, and notice that the trials themselves are specifically designed around the themes of the ascendancy they unlock. The trials for the warrior's ascendancies involve endurance and confrontation with overwhelming force. The trials for the sorceress's ascendancies involve manipulation of time and elemental force. This is not just thematic decoration. The game is making an argument through its design that the ascendancy path requires not just the acquisition of power, but the demonstration of a particular relationship to power. You do not simply choose to be a Titan or a Stormweaver. You prove that you have already internalized what being a Titan or a Stormweaver requires. The world of Wraeclast is also a world in which the concept of the self is complicated. The Eternal Empire's immortality experiments establish that consciousness can survive the death of the body, but at a cost. The entities that move through the ruins of that empire, the things that were once scholars and soldiers and servants of the God Emperor, exist in a state where the continuity between what they were and what they are now is genuinely uncertain. The 6 base classes of Path of Exile 2 have not undergone that kind of transformation. They are at the start of the game fully themselves, but the powers they develop in the course of the game, particularly through the ascendancy paths, bring some of them into contact with forces that challenge the integrity of the self in ways that are not entirely unlike what the Eternal Empire's subjects went through. The game handles this with care. It does not turn every character into a meditation on identity dissolution, but it keeps the question in the frame, particularly for the classes whose ascendancy paths involve the most radical kinds of transformation. The opening act of Path of Exile 2 establishes Wraeclast as a place that has been damaged in specific and layered ways. The coast where the exiles first arrive shows evidence of multiple historical periods overlaid on each other. Vol Foundation supporting Eternal Empire construction, supporting more recent structures that have been allowed to decay. This is deliberate. The game wants you to understand from the first few minutes that you are walking through a place that has been inhabited and destroyed and re-inhabited across a timeline much longer than any individual human life. The classes arrive in this place with different degrees of awareness of that history, and that difference is itself meaningful. The warrior probably knows less about the Vol than the sorceress does. The monk has a relationship to the world's history that is neither the warrior's ignorance nor the sorceress's scholarship. These are not just personality differences. They are different positions in relation to the knowledge that this world contains. The question of what a character knows and does not know at the start of the game is important, because it shapes what they are learning as the game progresses. The game's story is not just the story of defeating enemies and accumulating power. It is the story of characters developing an understanding of where they are and why it matters. The sorceress arrives with intellectual tools for understanding what she finds. The warrior arrives with physical tools. The mercenary arrives with professional tools. Each class's arc in terms of its lore development involves the application of those tools to a situation that eventually exceeds them, requiring the character to reach for something further than what they started with. The ascendancies are, in this sense, the moment when that reach becomes definitive. Path of Exile 2 is also a game that takes silence seriously as a narrative tool. There are things it does not explain. There are mysteries it introduces and does not resolve. There are characters who appear, say something significant, and are never seen again. This is not a failure of exposition. It is a deliberate aesthetic choice, and it is one that the original game also made. The game trusts its players to live with uncertainty, and it trusts that uncertainty which is well constructed is more interesting than answers that arrive too cleanly. The lore of the classes participates in this. The origins of each class are detailed enough to be meaningful, but not so complete that they foreclose interpretation. There are gaps, and the gaps are where the most interesting questions live. There is one more thing worth establishing before we reach the classes themselves. And it is the nature of Wraeclast's ongoing crisis at the time Path of Exile 2 begins. The game's story involves a specific antagonist, a specific form of corruption that has intensified or renewed or transformed in the period between the two games. And this antagonist is connected to the deep history in ways that require the full lore of the world to understand. The antagonist is not simply evil in the way that many game antagonists are. They are the expression of a problem that the world has been carrying since the Fall. A problem that various civilizations have managed or ignored or made worse by turns, and which has now reached a point where the ordinary management of it is no longer sufficient. The 6 classes of Path of Exile 2 are the 6 different kinds of people who arrive at this moment, in this place, at this particular stage of a very old problem, and that is where we begin. Each class's chapter that follows this one takes the same basic approach. It starts with who the character is before the game begins, which means their origin, their culture, their relationship to the powers they will develop. It then moves to what the game does with them, which means the specific lore of their progression in the world they move through. And it ends with the ascendancies, which means the specific ideological and cosmological positions that represent the fullest development of each class's relationship to power. Along the way, the lore of the world fills in around each class the way it should, because the classes are not separate from the world. They are of it, and the world is different depending on which of them is looking. The material in this script comes from item descriptions and NPC dialogue and environmental storytelling, and the specific text that the game attaches to its skills and ascendancy nodes. Some of it is well documented in the community. Some of it is less discussed. I made choices about which threads to follow and which to leave for another time, and those choices are reflected in what you are about to hear. They were made in service of the through line, which is the argument that the 6 classes of Path of Exile 2 are best understood not as individual archetypes, but as positions within a single long story that Wraeclast has been telling for a very long time. That story is what this video is about. The deepest thing the game communicates, if you stay with it long enough, is something about the relationship between power and inheritance. Every civilization in this world built on the wreckage of the one before it. Every form of magic has roots in older magic. Every catastrophe was possible because someone before you made a choice that felt reasonable at the time. The 6 classes of Path of Exile 2 step into this inheritance, each one carrying a different piece of it, each one discovering in the course of the game how much weight that inheritance actually has. What you find when you look closely at each class is not just a character. It is a question the world is asking about what should be done with what has already been done. And the answer the game provides is not simple, but it is honest, and it is worth spending 8 hours with. The weight of Wraeclast is not metaphorical. It is embedded in its soil, in the stones of its ruins, in the entities that walk its broken corridors, waiting for something they cannot name. Every exile who arrives on its coast carries something into that weight, something personal and specific and usually fragile. What happens to those things in the course of the game, whether they survive or transform or are burned away entirely, is the real subject of the lore. Not the gods, not the empires, not the forces of corruption and destruction, though all of those matter. The real subject is what a person does when the world they arrived in turns out to be stranger and older and more demanding than anything they were prepared for. Chapter 2. The Warrior, the Warrior. If you are looking for a place to start when thinking about what Path of Exile 2 is doing with its class roster, this is probably it. Not because the Warrior is the most complicated class, but because the Warrior is the class whose power is easiest to misread. It looks simple. It is not simple. A person who strikes things with a large weapon until they stop moving is not doing nothing philosophically. In a world defined by ancient forces and cosmological politics, and the lingering wreckage of multiple civilizations, choosing to solve problems with your body is itself a position, and the game takes that position seriously. The Warrior of Path of Exile 2 is a character whose origins are military in the most direct and institutional sense. This is not a mercenary who drifted into combat as a profession, nor a noble who trained with weapons as a matter of social expectation. The Warrior is a product of a specific military tradition that has its own history and its own ideology, and that history and ideology are embedded in what the class does and how it does it. The exile that brought the Warrior to Wraeclast was not a surprise. People from the Warrior's background understand, from early in their training, that exile is a possible end, because the military structures they serve operate with a kind of political exposure that makes their practitioners vulnerable to the shifts of power above them. A soldier is useful until they are inconvenient. The Warrior's exile represents the moment of inconvenience. The body is the Warrior's primary philosophical commitment, and this is worth taking seriously as a piece of lore rather than just a mechanical observation. In a world where magic reshapes reality and divine forces contend for dominance, and the boundary between the living and the dead is less stable than it should be, the decision to place your trust in physical force is not naive. It is a kind of epistemological position. The Warrior operates on the assumption that what can be hit can be defeated. And that assumption, while it encounters its limits in Wraeclast, is more robust than it might initially appear. Physical force has a clarity that more esoteric approaches lack. It does not depend on the stability of magical systems that might be corrupted or reversed or turned against you. It does not require a relationship with an entity whose intentions are not fully transparent. It depends on your own mass and your own speed and your own willingness to continue. And those are things a warrior can trust in a way they cannot always trust anything else. The warrior's relationship to armor is one of the more interesting pieces of the class's lore, partly because armor in Path of Exile 2 is not simply protective equipment. The game treats armor as a specific kind of magical technology, a way of shaping the space immediately around the body to resist incoming forces. The armor that the warrior uses is heavier and more comprehensive than what any other class typically employs, and the game's systems reflect the specific philosophy behind it, which is that comprehensive physical resistance is achievable if you are willing to commit entirely to it. Other classes compromise. The warrior does not, or at least the warrior's ideal form does not. The ascendancy paths develop this further in different directions, but the commitment to physical dominance as the primary strategy runs through both of them. The specific culture the warrior comes from in Path of Exile 2 is connected to the military traditions of Wraeclast's surviving human civilizations, which means it is connected, at several removes, to the Eternal Empire's military organization. The Eternal Empire had a professional soldier class, and that class persisted through the Empire's fragmentation in various forms, each one adapting to the political reality of whatever successor state it found itself in. The warrior's tradition is one of these adapted forms, which means it carries within it the residue of Eternal Empire military doctrine. The emphasis on formation fighting, on holding ground, on the tactical use of terrain, on the distinction between what you protect and what you sacrifice. These are not abstract values for the warrior. They are operational habits that shape how the class approaches every encounter. The warrior's exile is typically framed, in the game's backstory, as the result of a conflict between institutional loyalty and personal integrity. The military structures that produce warriors operate according to orders, and orders in a politically fragmented world eventually require a soldier to do something that cannot be reconciled with what they believe themselves to be. The warrior's exile is the moment when that reconciliation fails, when the soldier in question decides that following the order is not compatible with remaining the person they have worked to become. This is not always a dramatic moment of principled refusal. Sometimes it is simply a refusal to participate in something, a turning away that others interpret as disloyalty, a small act that the institution treats as a large one. The warrior does not usually arrive in Wraeclast as a martyr. They arrive as someone who made a decision and is now living with its consequences. The physical world of Wraeclast responds to the warrior in specific ways. The ruins that the warrior moves through were built, in many cases, by civilizations that also understood military force. And there is a dialogue between the warrior's physical approach and the physical architecture of the world that is different from the dialogue other classes have. The warrior fits into Vaal spaces differently than a sorceress does. The Vaal built for ceremony and for access by their magical practitioners, which means many of their spaces are not designed with the warrior's approach in mind. But the Eternal Empire's ruins, particularly its military installations and its frontier fortifications, have a different relationship to someone who moves the way a warrior moves. There is a familiarity there, a recognition, even if the warrior does not consciously identify it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the warrior's skill progression, and notice that the earliest skills available to the class are defensive in a way that is not immediately intuitive for a class that emphasizes physical offense. The warrior learns to hold ground before learning to break it. The defensive skills come first, not because the warrior is fundamentally reactive, but because the tradition the warrior comes from understands that physical dominance begins with the refusal to move backward. You cannot advance towards something if you cannot first establish that you will not retreat from it. This sequencing is a piece of the class's lore embedded in its mechanics, and it says something about what the warrior tradition values. Not aggression as a first principle, but stability. The capacity to stand in a difficult place long enough that the difficulty around you loses its ability to dislodge you. The warrior's relationship to the other classes is defined by a specific kind of mutual respect and mutual incomprehension. The warrior and the mercenary understand each other at a practical level, both being professionals who solve problems through applied force. But the mercenary's relationship to that force is commercial in a way the warrior's is not, and the warrior notices this. The warrior and the monk share an emphasis on physical discipline, but diverge sharply on the source of that discipline's ultimate authority. The warrior and the sorceress operate in different registers entirely, which is not to say they cannot work together, but that their instincts about how to approach a problem are rarely aligned. These relational textures are not explicit in the game's dialogue, but are present in the way the game constructs each class's approach to the world. The warrior's class currency, if you want to think about it that way, is endurance. The game's mechanics formalize this through the endurance charge system, which gives the warrior access to a kind of accumulated resistance that builds through continued combat. But the endurance charge is not just a number on a screen. It is an expression of the class's fundamental orientation, which is that suffering damage is not the same as losing. The warrior who has endured 10 seconds of incoming force is not weaker for it. They are, in a specific and measurable way, more resistant than they were before they started. This is an unusual approach to power. Most sources of power in this game involve accumulation of an external resource. The warrior's deepest power involves the transformation of incoming damage into enhanced capacity, a conversion of what would destroy another character into something the warrior uses. That conversion is, in miniature, the story the warrior's lore tells. The warrior's ascendancy choices are the Titan and the Warbringer, and they represent two different interpretations of what physical dominance ultimately means. The Titan is the more inward of the two, emphasizing the development of the warrior's own body as the primary instrument of power. The Titan grows in a sense that the game makes both mechanical and suggestive towards something larger than the base class. Not literally larger, though the game's visual design for the Titan does suggest a kind of physical expansion, but larger in terms of the scale of force the class embodies. The Titan hits harder. The Titan takes more. The Titan is the class's commitment to physical dominance, taken as far as it can go within the frame of the individual body. The Titan's lore draws on something specific from Wraeclast's history, which is the tradition of giant craft among the civilizations that preceded the Eternal Empire. There is a piece of the game's mythology that involves beings of significant physical scale, not literal giants in the folkloric sense, but individuals who had undergone processes that expanded their physical capacity beyond what ordinary training can achieve. The Eternal Empire documented these beings in its historical records, both with fascination and with concern, because a being of sufficient physical scale and resilience is not easily administered. The Titan ascendancy implies a connection to this tradition, not necessarily a literal one, but a functional parallel. The Titan is developing toward a scale of physical power that puts them outside the normal parameters of what the world expects a human body to be. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the specific Titan ascendancy nodes, and notice that several of them explicitly reference the category of force that, in the game's physical systems, represents the most fundamental kind of physical power. These are not nodes that add to an existing numerical progression. They change the category of the warrior's physical presence. A Titan does not simply hit harder. A Titan hits in a way that affects the physical space around the hit, that creates waves and aftershocks and disruptions that have independent effects from the initial blow. This is the game making a lore argument through its mechanics. A Titan is not a stronger warrior. A Titan is a different kind of physical force in the world, one that operates at a scale where the distinction between the individual body and the surrounding environment begins to blur. The Warbringer takes a different path, and it is worth spending time on what makes the Warbringer's interpretation of the warrior different from the Titan's, rather than simply complementary to it. The Warbringer turns outward, where the Titan turns inward. The Titan's power is concentrated in the individual body, and radiates outward from there. The Warbringer's power involves a relationship with something outside the individual body, specifically the capacity to call upon forces that fight alongside the warrior in a form that is connected to ancient traditions of war magic and Wraeclast history. The Warbringer is the class that most explicitly connects the warrior tradition to the deeper history of warfare in this world. The totems that the Warbringer employs are not modern inventions. They are a technology that predates the Eternal Empire, one of the forms of power that the civilizations before Chidas's empire used to prosecute warfare before the development of the immortality research that made that empire unique. Totems in Path of Exile's lore are not simple constructions. They are objects that have been made into vessels for a specific kind of power, and the power they contain is drawn from a tradition that the game never fully specifies, but consistently presents as older and differently rooted than the Eternal Empire's magic. The Warbringer's relationship to these older traditions is what distinguishes it from the Titan. The Titan is the most developed form of the warrior's own body. The Warbringer is a warrior who has recognized that their power is not entirely their own, that the tradition they come from has resources beyond the individual practitioner, and that accessing those resources requires a different kind of relationship to the history of the craft. The Warbringer is, in this sense, the more historically aware of the two warrior ascendancies. The Titan asks what the body can become. The Warbringer asks what the tradition has always known, and what it means to carry that knowledge forward. The specific war magic tradition that the Warbringer connects to is one that the Eternal Empire documented with considerable ambivalence. The Empire had its own military traditions, as noted, but those traditions were built on institutional structures and the authority of the state. The totem tradition the Warbringer accesses operates outside institutional structures. It was practiced by cultures that the Eternal Empire absorbed or displaced or attempted to eliminate. Cultures whose relationship to force and to the sacred power behind force was different from anything the Empire developed on its own. The fact that this tradition survived, that it persisted through the Eternal Empire's period of dominance, and through the collapse of that empire, and into the present moment that Path of Exile 2 depicts, is itself a piece of lore. Some things are more durable than empires. The Warbringer's totems are not decorative. The game gives them specific mechanical properties that reflect the tradition they come from, particularly the property of persistence, the capacity to continue functioning independently of the warrior's own moment-to-moment actions. A totem that has been placed continues working even while the warrior is doing something else. This independence is significant in terms of the class's lore because it reflects the traditional view of what a totem is, which is a repository of will that does not require continuous active direction. The Warbringer sets something in motion and then moves, and the thing they set in motion carries their intention forward on its own. That is a different model of power from the Titans, and a different model from most of what the Eternal Empire developed, and its persistence suggests something about its vitality that the more modern approaches do not always have. The warrior's journey through Path of Exile 2 is one of mounting scale. The class begins in a state where its power is explicitly personal, where the warrior is one person with a weapon facing threats that are larger than any one person should face. By the time the warrior reaches the end of the main narrative, and the ascendancy choice that follows it, that personal scale has expanded. Not in terms of the number of people the warrior commands, or the social structures they are embedded in, but in terms of the specific magnitude of force they have become capable of embodying or channeling. The warrior at the end of their arc is not more than human, in the way a corrupted being is more than human. They are more than what the warrior was at the start, in a way that remains essentially human. The tradition that made them what they are is still recognizably the tradition they came from, even if they have pushed it further than anyone in their cultural memory did before. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the warrior's class specific dialogue in certain key encounters, and notice that the character consistently interprets what they are encountering in terms of force and resistance, rather than in terms of the cosmological or theological frameworks that other classes bring to the same situations. When the warrior encounters a divine figure, their response is not theological, it is tactical. When the warrior encounters evidence of the Eternal Empire's experiments, their response is not scholarly, it is physical. A reading of the space in terms of where the danger is and what it would take to address it. This is not in curiosity. It is a consistent epistemological priority, a way of knowing the world that privileges what can be verified through force over what can only be verified through interpretation. The warrior's relationship to the game's divine entities is therefore distinctive. Where the monk approaches a divine encounter as a practitioner in a related tradition, and the sorceress approaches it as a scholar with analytical tools, the warrior approaches it as someone who needs to determine whether this entity can be hurt, and if so, how. This has led some players to read the warrior as the class least engaged with the game's deeper lore, and there is a superficial truth to that reading, but it misses something. which is that the warrior's physical orientation is itself a lore position. The game is not suggesting that the warrior's approach is naive or limited. It is suggesting that in a world full of things that claim cosmological significance, the warrior's insistence on physical verification is a specific and defensible way of engaging with claims that have not yet been tested. The warrior and the concept of exile intersect in a way that is worth noting separately. Military exile is not uncommon in the historical traditions that Path of Exile draws on. The soldier who becomes inconvenient to the state, the officer whose loyalty becomes suspect, the general who wins too many victories and thereby becomes a political threat. These are archetypes with long histories in real human cultures, and the warrior's backstory participates in all of them to different degrees, depending on how the player reads the available lore. What is consistent is the sense that the warrior's exile was, in some respect, a consequence of competence, not incompetence, not failure. The warrior was sent away because being too good at what they do in the service of an institution is eventually something that institutions find uncomfortable. The warrior's arc in the game is not a story of redemption, because the warrior does not understand their situation as having required redemption. It is a story of continuation. The exile did not break the warrior's relationship to the tradition they came from, even though it broke their relationship to the specific institution that tradition served. The warrior carries the tradition with them into Wraeclast and continues applying it to whatever presents itself, including the much larger and stranger threats that Wraeclast contains. This is the warrior's basic dignity as a character, and the game preserves it throughout. The sense that this person knows what they are and knows what they can do, and that the world's strangeness does not change that fundamental fact about them. The gear that a warrior uses, and particularly the weapons, carries specific lore content that is worth attending to. The Great Maul, the Warhammer, the Mace and Shield, these are not weapons that emerged from the Eternal Empire's scholarship, or from the Val's experimental programs. They are weapons from a tradition of straightforward violence that predates both of those civilizations, or at least developed independently of their more esoteric innovations. When a warrior picks up a weapon, they are picking up something with a very long history of killing things, and that history is embedded in the object in a way that is different from the embeddedness of, say, a corrupted gem in a wand. The weapon has a clarity of purpose that the more sophisticated magical implements often lack. The warrior's endurance charges, as noted, are the class's signature mechanical feature, but the lore that surrounds them is worth expanding on, because endurance charges in Path of Exile are not just a buff, they are a representation of a specific metaphysical state, a state in which the body has been stressed enough to develop a kind of reactive hardening. The game's item descriptions for gear that interacts with endurance charges often reference this hardening in terms that suggest it is not simply physical. The body that has endured and adapted is different in some fundamental way from the body that has not. The warrior who carries endurance charges into a fight is carrying the memory of every previous challenge within them, converted into present moment capacity. That conversion is the warrior's deepest power, and it is also the warrior's deepest piece of lore. There is a moment in the warrior's progression when the class begins to interact with the game's deeper lore that the physical tradition collides with something it was not designed to address. The forces that the Val worked with, and that the Eternal Empire experimented with, are not things that respond straightforwardly to physical force. They are not immune to it, but they operate in a register where hitting them is necessary but not sufficient. The warrior's development in the game involves encountering these forces and discovering that their tradition, while genuinely powerful, has limits, and that those limits correspond to the places where the physical and the metaphysical intersect in ways that the warrior's training did not prepare them for. How the class responds to these limits is where the ascendancy paths diverge most meaningfully. The Titan responds by pushing through, by becoming more, by insisting that if the problem is one of scale, The solution is to increase scale until the problem responds to it. There is something admirable in this insistence, and the game does not mock it. But there is also something that suggests the Titan is discovering the limits of the warrior's original epistemological commitment, which is the commitment to force as a verification method. If the thing you are facing does not fully respond to force, force alone does not settle the question of what to do next. The Titan's answer is more force, more scale, more physical presence. Whether that answer is sufficient is something the player gets to decide. The Warbringer responds differently, by drawing on the tradition's deeper roots. The parts of the warrior tradition that the institutional military organizations suppressed or forgot, but that the original practice contained. The totem tradition is not simply a better kind of weapon. It is an older way of understanding what force is and where it comes from. The Warbringer, when they reach their limit against forces that do not respond to purely physical approaches, finds that the tradition they were taught had resources they were not initially shown. That discovery is the Warbringer's arc, and it is a piece of lore about what traditions contain versus what they choose to teach. The world of Path of Exile 2 is, among other things, a world that has been broken by excessive ambition. And the warrior is a class that demonstrates what happens when ambition is applied to the right questions and the right measure. Not every problem in Wraeclast was caused by someone who hit things too hard. Most of them were caused by someone who reached for something they should not have reached for. Something too old or too large or too willing to be reached for by anyone who would agree to its terms. The warrior's tradition, with its emphasis on the physical and the proven, is a tradition that has avoided those particular mistakes, not through superior wisdom necessarily, but through the specific calibration of what it considers worth pursuing. The warrior does not try to become a god. The Titan does not try to become a god. The Warbringer does not try to summon one. This restraint, if you want to call it that, is one of the things that makes the warrior a distinctive presence in the lore. Because Wraeclast is full of traditions that ended badly because they did not exercise it. The warrior's tragedy, if the class has one, is not hubris. It is the discovery that the world contains problems that restraint cannot solve. That some things require you to step outside the tradition that formed you, and that stepping outside it might mean you cannot step back in. What the Warriors chapter ultimately says about Path of Exile 2's relationship to physical power is this: the game respects it. The game does not treat the body as a limitation to be transcended, or a primitive instrument to be left behind, as the player gains access to more sophisticated sources of power. The warrior is not the game's tutorial character, the class you play when you do not yet know what you are doing. The warrior is the class that most clearly embodies a specific argument about what power is, which is that power rooted in the body and the tradition that trained the body has a kind of integrity that more complex forms of power sometimes lack. The warrior hits things, and in a world where many of the most dangerous entities in the game's history were defeated or made more dangerous by someone thinking too much, there is something worth respecting about a tradition that decided to stop thinking and start hitting, and got very good at it. The warrior's presence in Wraeclast is a reminder that the world has been through catastrophes before, and that someone, usually someone who solved the problem primarily through applied force rather than sophisticated theory, helped it survive them. The Val's experiments ended with a cataclysm. The Eternal Empire's research ended with a collapse. The warrior's tradition has not ended. It has exiled itself, and exiled itself again, and it is still here, carrying its endurance charges and its warhammers into whatever comes next. That continuity is not nothing. In a world that has destroyed its most ambitious civilizations, the thing that survives through sheer physical persistence has its own kind of significance. The warrior's final form, through either ascendancy path, is something that could not have been predicted from the starting character, but that is entirely consistent with it. The Titan who has grown into their scale, or the Warbringer who has reconnected with the tradition's oldest resources, is still recognizably the person who arrived on Wraeclast's coast with a weapon and a willingness to continue. The changes that have happened to them are changes in magnitude, not in kind. This is distinct from what happens to several other classes by the end of their arcs. And that distinction is itself a piece of the game's argument about what the warrior tradition ultimately is: durable, honest about its nature, and better at surviving the world's various attempts to end it than almost anything else the world has produced. The warrior represents the thing in Wraeclast that hits back. Not the smartest thing, not the most cosmologically significant thing, not the most connected to the deep forces that shaped the world, but the thing that, when the world brings its full weight to bear, responds by bringing its own weight to bear in return. In a world full of entities that operate through subtlety and indirection, and the manipulation of forces too abstract to hit, the warrior's insistence on direct physical engagement is not a disadvantage. It is a clarification. This is what power is. This is what it is for. This is what happens when it meets an obstacle. The warrior makes that argument with their body, and the argument in Wraeclast's particular context turns out to hold. That is, ultimately, the warrior's piece of the larger story Path of Exile 2 is telling. The world is broken in complicated ways. Some of those complications require complicated solutions, but some of them just need someone to stand in the way of what is breaking them, and to endure until the breaking stops. The warrior is that someone, and the tradition that made them that someone is older and more resilient than most of the forces currently trying to end the world. The warrior does not need to understand everything about what they are fighting. They need to understand that it can be fought, and that fighting it is what they are here to do. Chapter 3. The Ranger is the class that most completely embodies Wraeclast's relationship to the wild, which is to say the parts of this continent that are not ruins and not administered and not yet claimed by any of the forces that have been trying to claim things for thousands of years. Wraeclast has a great deal of unclaimed space. Most of it is dangerous. The Ranger is the class that knows this space the way you know something you have spent your life in, which means intimately, practically, and without any of the romantic projections that civilized people attach to wilderness from a comfortable distance. The Ranger's background is tribal in the most precise sense of that word. Not tribal as shorthand for primitive or undeveloped, but tribal as a description of a specific social organization. Small, mobile, deeply connected to a particular stretch of terrain, reliant on accumulated knowledge of that terrain for survival, and structured around the skills that survival requires. The Ranger comes from a culture that has been present on Wraeclast since before the Eternal Empire, and possibly since before the Vol. And that persistence is not accidental. It reflects a specific strategy for existing in a world that has repeatedly destroyed its most ambitious civilizations. Do not become too ambitious. Do not accumulate what you cannot carry. Do not build what you cannot abandon. Stay mobile. Stay knowledgeable. Stay alive. This is not a strategy without costs. The Ranger's culture is one of constraint as much as freedom, because the kind of mobility that ensures survival also limits what can be built and what can be preserved, and what can be passed forward to the next generation. The deep knowledge of terrain and creature behavior and natural resource use that the Ranger carries is genuinely sophisticated knowledge, developed over many generations of careful attention. But it is knowledge that does not produce monuments. It does not produce scholarship that outsiders can access and evaluate. It produces people who are very good at surviving in places where other people die. And it produces a specific kind of relationship to the world that the game's other classes do not have. The Ranger's relationship to the natural world of Wraeclast is complicated by the fact that Wraeclast's natural world is not clean in the way that a pristine wilderness would be. The corruption that began with the Vol and was extended by the Eternal Empire and has continued developing in the centuries since, has affected the land itself. The animals of Wraeclast are not ordinary animals. The plants are not ordinary plants. The weather systems and the river systems and the cave systems of this continent have all been touched by the same forces that collapsed its civilizations. And the Ranger's culture has had to develop its understanding of the natural world, specifically in the context of a natural world that has been altered by magical corruption. What the Ranger knows about animals is not what a naturalist in a healthy world would know. It is knowledge of creatures that have adapted to corruption, that carry it in their tissue or their behavior or both, and that are therefore different in specific ways from what they would have been before any of this happened. The Ranger's exile is typically the result of a conflict between the Ranger's cultural belonging and the demands of the larger world that surrounds their culture. The tribal societies that produce Rangers are not invisible to the political structures of Wraeclast. They are tolerated or absorbed or displaced depending on what the political structure in question finds convenient. And the Ranger's personal exile often represents the moment when a specific political structure decided that a specific Ranger was more useful as a cautionary example than as a free-ranging person. Sometimes the Ranger committed what the outside world calls a crime, and their own culture calls a justified act. Sometimes the Ranger's skills attracted the attention of people who wanted to control those skills, and the Ranger refused to be controlled. Sometimes the Ranger's exile is the result of internal cultural conflict, where belonging to the outside world's legal system was the price of something the Ranger could not pay. The bow is the Ranger's defining weapon, and the game takes this seriously as a lore choice. The bow is not a weapon of civilization. It is not a product of the metallurgical and industrial traditions that produce swords and maces. It is a product of the relationship between a person and the materials their environment provides. A relationship that has to be continuous and attentive to work well. A bow made well is made from knowledge of a specific tree in a specific season harvested in a specific way. And the knowledge of how to do that correctly is not written down in any text the Eternal Empire produced. It lives in the people who learned it. And when those people are gone, the knowledge goes with them. The Ranger carries this kind of knowledge, and the bow they use reflects it in a way that the warrior's mass-produced weapons do not. The Ranger's movement through Wraeclast is different from every other class's movement. The Ranger reads terrain. They notice what is different about a section of ground from a section they passed 20 minutes ago. They notice what the behavior of the ambient creatures suggests about what is further in. They notice the specific quality of the light and the sound and the smell of a place, and extract information from those sensory inputs that other classes simply do not process. This is not a magical ability. The Ranger does not have supernatural perception, at least not in the base class form. It is the result of a cultural investment in a specific kind of attention, maintained across generations, that has made this person's relationship to sensory information genuinely different from that of someone who grew up in a city. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Ranger's approach to enemy encounters, and notice that the class consistently positions at the edge of engagement rather than at the center. This is not cowardice. It is a tactical expression of the same culture that produced the bow. The Ranger's culture did not survive by fighting battles of attrition. It survived by understanding the terrain well enough to control the terms of engagement, by knowing where to be and when, by choosing encounters that were weighted in advance through positioning and preparation, rather than through raw capacity for absorbing damage. The Ranger in Wraeclast applies this same logic to every situation, including situations that the logic was not designed for, which is why the class's development involves the progressive expansion of a survival strategy into a genuinely formidable form of power. The Ranger's skills in Path of Exile 2 express a consistent philosophy: create distance, control space, impose your terms on the encounter before the encounter happens. The projectile skills, the trapping skills, the movement skills. All of them are expressions of the same underlying approach. The ranger does not want to be where the danger is while the danger is there. The ranger wants to have determined in advance what path the danger will take, and to have placed the relevant countermeasures along that path. This is not a passive approach in any real sense. Setting traps and controlling sightlines and choosing ambush positions are active, demanding work, but they are work that happens before the enemy arrives, rather than in the moment of their arrival. And that temporal difference is central to the ranger's way of engaging with the world. The natural poisons and alchemical compounds that some ranger builds employ are another expression of the culture's relationship to the natural world. The ranger's culture developed knowledge of Wraeclast toxic flora and fauna in the same spirit that it developed knowledge of bowcraft, out of necessity carefully across generations. The things that can kill you in Wraeclast are numerous and creative. The ranger's culture learned to identify them, to understand their mechanisms, and eventually to use them. A poison arrow is not simply a nastier arrow. It is evidence of a specific kind of knowledge about the world. Knowledge that is practically impossible to develop in a generation, and that represents the accumulated investment of many generations of careful attention to what the world contains. The ranger's ascendancy paths are the Deadeye and the Pathfinder, and they represent two interpretations of what the ranger's underlying culture produces at its most fully realized. The Deadeye is the perfectionist. The Pathfinder is the pragmatist. The Deadeye says that the ranger tradition, taken seriously enough, produces a specific relationship to accuracy that goes beyond what normal skill training can achieve. The Pathfinder says that the ranger tradition, taken seriously enough, produces a specific relationship to the natural world's chemical and alchemical properties that can be developed into something extraordinary. Both are legitimate interpretations of the same underlying culture, and both point toward aspects of the ranger's background that the base class only begins to explore. The Deadeye's lore is built around an idea that appears in several places in Path of Exile's world building, which is the idea that skill, practiced long enough and deeply enough, eventually crosses a threshold where it begins to involve something beyond ordinary human capacity. The Deadeye does not simply aim well. The Deadeye, at their most developed, shoots in ways that challenge the ordinary physics of projectile motion. The arrows find paths that are not the paths they should take. They strike things they should not be able to strike from the angle of the shot. The game frames this not as magic in the usual sense, but as a form of mastery so deep that the practitioner has developed a functional understanding of the world's physical laws that allows them to exploit those laws in ways no one trained for less than a lifetime could reproduce. This idea that extreme skill eventually produces something that looks like magic to the outside observer is one that the Path of Exile world takes seriously in multiple places. The warrior's endurance charges gesture toward it. The monk's meditative practices gesture toward it more explicitly. The Deadeye is the ranger's version of it, and the specific domain is accuracy, the capacity to place a projectile exactly where it needs to go regardless of what should theoretically prevent that placement. The lore behind the Deadeye's distinctive projectile behaviors, the fact that arrows can chain between targets, the fact that projectiles can fork and return and strike from multiple angles. All of this is explained within the game's framework, not as the application of external magical power, but as the application of an understanding of physical space so comprehensive that the practitioner can, in effect, shape the trajectories of their shots through sheer precision of intention. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Deadeye's ascendancy nodes that deal with the range and speed of projectiles, and notice that the descriptions reference not the magical enhancement of the projectile, but the enhancement of the practitioner's perception. The Deadeye does not make faster arrows. The Deadeye perceives the world in a way that makes an ordinary arrow sufficient for extraordinary results. This is the game insisting on the lore reading. The Deadeye's power is a function of seeing the world with unusual clarity. and that clarity is the product of the same tradition that produced the Ranger in the first place. It is the tradition's deepest expression, the most fully developed form of the attentiveness that the culture values. The Pathfinder's lore is rooted in a different aspect of the Ranger's culture, which is the knowledge of the natural world's alchemical properties. The Ranger's culture knew, from centuries of observation, which plants produced which effects and in which combinations and under which conditions. This knowledge was not magical in origin, but it was not straightforwardly mundane either, because the natural world of Wraeclast is not a mundane natural world. The plants and creatures of this continent have been shaped by the same forces that shaped everything else here, and some of them have properties that go well beyond ordinary chemistry. The Pathfinder is the class that has taken this knowledge and developed it systematically, not in the way a scholar in a library develops knowledge, but in the way a practitioner in the field develops knowledge, through use, through observation, through the accumulation of specific experiences rather than general principles. The flasks that the Pathfinder employs are the most obvious expression of this, and the flask mechanics in Path of Exile are one of the game's most distinctive systems. For the Pathfinder, flasks are not consumables in the ordinary game mechanical sense. They are tools of a specific tradition, containers for knowledge about the world's alchemical properties, deployed with precision and awareness of timing that the tradition developed over many years. The Pathfinder's relationship to their flasks is not the relationship of a person using a resource. It is the relationship of a practitioner using an instrument they understand completely, which means using it at exactly the right moment and for exactly the right purpose, and knowing, from the tradition they carry, exactly what it will produce. The Pathfinder's specific relationship to poisons and ailments and elemental infusions connects back to the same cultural knowledge base. The Ranger's culture learned what the world's various substances do to living things, and the Pathfinder has extended that knowledge in the direction of systematic application. A Pathfinder who applies a particular poison is not guessing at the effect. They are applying something they know, from the tradition and from direct experience, will produce a specific result in a specific time frame. This certainty is itself a kind of power, because it means the Pathfinder can plan around effects that a less knowledgeable practitioner would have to hope for. The relationship between the Ranger and the other classes involves a specific kind of practical knowledge that the other classes mostly lack. The Ranger knows a Wraeclast in a way that none of the city-trained or institution-trained classes can replicate. They know which paths through a forest are safe at which times of day. They know which creatures are territorial, and which are opportunistic, and which are controlled by something they cannot see. They know the landscape in its own terms, rather than in the terms that the civilizations that passed through it imposed on it. This is useful knowledge, and it is knowledge that the other classes often need without knowing they need it. The Ranger's contribution to any encounter in the game's world is frequently the dimension the other classes missed. The Ranger's tribe, or what remains of the tribe after the exile, is a source of ongoing resonance in the class's lore. Exile from a tribal culture is not the same as exile from a state or an institution. A state or institution is large enough that your absence from it does not define you completely. A tribe is small enough that leaving it or being forced out of it removes you from the entire social structure that gave you meaning. The Ranger in Wraeclast is not simply a person without a home country. They are a person who has lost the community that defined their identity. And the skills they carry are both the expression of that community and the thing that makes being without it survivable. The bow is the tribe. The knowledge of terrain is the tribe. The attentiveness that was trained by the culture survives the culture's loss. This is in a different key, the same story the warrior tells about the military tradition. But the Ranger's version is more intimate because the unit involved is smaller. The warrior lost their institutional belonging. The Ranger lost something more personal. And the game's writing reflects this in the specific emotional register the Ranger brings to encounters with others who are surviving outside normal structures. The Ranger recognizes exile in a way that the Warrior, who understood exile as a professional hazard, does not quite experience it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Ranger's interactions with the game's environmental storytelling, and notice that the class picks up on different details than other classes would. The Ranger notices the secondary effects of what happened in a space, the disruption to the natural patterns, the creatures that fled or were drawn in, the plants that were changed by what was done there. These observations do not always contribute to the immediate tactical situation, but they constitute a different kind of evidence about what happened in a place and what might happen next. The Ranger is reading a different layer of the world, one that the more cosmologically focused classes tend to overlook entirely. The Ranger's relationship to the concept of exile contains a specific irony that the game does not fully articulate, but that is visible in the lore. The Ranger comes from a culture that is itself, in a sense, always in exile, always on the margins of the civilized world, always occupying the spaces that the empires and institutions do not currently find worth claiming. To be exiled from that culture is to be pushed even further out, beyond even the margins. And yet, in Wraeclast, where most of the civilization has already collapsed, and the margins are where the surviving world exists, the Ranger's double marginalization resolves into a specific kind of fitness. The Ranger was always trained for this. The particular combination of skills and knowledge and psychological orientation that exile from the tribe required. That was exactly what Wraeclast in its current state rewards. The Ranger's progression in Path of Exile 2 is the progression of someone discovering that the skills which allowed them to survive on the margins of civilization are more than adequate for survival in the ruins of it. The Warrior discovers this through force. The Ranger discovers it through competence, through the specific, non-theatrical demonstration that what they know and how they move through the world is not inferior to what the more centrally positioned classes can do. It is different, and in Wraeclast, different often means more applicable. The Deadeye's ultimate development, where the accuracy tradition produces something that looks indistinguishable from supernatural ability to any observer who lacks the tradition's framework, is a piece of lore that says something specific about the game's relationship to the boundary between skill and magic. Path of Exile is a game that takes magic seriously, but it is also a game that occasionally suggests that the boundary between skilled practice and magical ability is fuzzier than it appears. The Deadeye is one of the clearest instances of this suggestion. The class does not explain away its extraordinary projectile behaviors as purely physical, but it does insist that they are a development of a physical tradition rather than a departure from it. That insistence is itself a position on what magic is and where it comes from. The Pathfinder's equivalent development, where the knowledge of natural chemistry becomes something that operates at a scale beyond what natural chemistry should produce, follows a parallel logic. The flasks that a fully realized Pathfinder uses are not doing what a flask normally does. They are producing effects that the natural substances they contain should not produce at the concentrations and applications involved. The game's explanation, embedded in its mechanics and its item descriptions, is that the Pathfinder's knowledge has become so comprehensive that it includes knowledge of the substance's potential rather than just their typical behavior. The Pathfinder knows what a thing can do under conditions that do not naturally occur, and that knowledge, applied carefully, can produce those conditions and those effects. The Ranger in Wraeclast is also, because of their cultural background, the class most likely to notice things that do not fit. The ruins that the other classes move through with varying degrees of comprehension are, to the Ranger, environments that can be read for incongruities, places where what is there does not match what should be there, given what the Ranger knows about the surrounding land. The corrupted creatures do not move the way uncorrupted creatures move. The vegetation near sources of corruption does not grow the way unaffected vegetation grows. The Ranger notices these things not because they have studied corruption academically, but because they have spent their life reading the natural world for exactly this kind of mismatch. This capacity for environmental reading gives the ranger a form of intelligence gathering that is different from anything the scholarly classes produce. The sorceress can analyze what is happening in a corrupted space in terms of the magical forces involved. The ranger can tell you something has been wrong here for a longer time than the corruption appears, or that something used this space recently and is probably still nearby, or that what appears to be a straightforward corrupted creature is moving in a way that suggests something else is influencing it. These observations are not higher level than the sorceresses. They are a different level entirely, operating on different data through different methods and producing different information. The ranger's final piece of the game's larger story is about what survives civilizational collapse. The Val fell. The Eternal Empire fell. The cultures that those civilizations absorbed or displaced or attempted to eliminate have in various forms continued. Not because they were stronger than the empires, not because they had access to better sources of power, but because they were not organized in a way that made them vulnerable to the specific kinds of failure that take down empires. A mobile culture that does not accumulate more than it can carry does not fail catastrophically when its infrastructure is destroyed, because its infrastructure is its people, and its people are already carrying it. The ranger's culture is one of those survivors, and the ranger carries that survival with them into Wraeclast as a kind of structural resilience that complements the specific skills they developed within it. What the ranger says about Path of Exile 2's world is ultimately about the value of embedded knowledge. Knowledge that lives in practice rather than in texts, in hands rather than in libraries. The Eternal Empire's library is gone. The Val's scholarship is mostly inaccessible, except through ruins that require interpretation. The ranger's knowledge has survived because it was never written down to be destroyed. It was carried forward in the specific behaviors and attentions of people who kept the culture alive through their practice of it. That kind of knowledge is harder to destroy than monuments, and it is, in Wraeclast's current state, often more applicable. The ranger moves through Wraeclast's broken landscape the way water moves through broken stone, finding the paths that remain rather than lamenting the ones that closed. The Deadai's arrows find their targets through obstacles that should stop them. The Pathfinder's remedies draw on resources that the ruins of civilization dismissed as too humble to matter. Both ascendancies are expressions of the same underlying truth in a world that has destroyed its grandest ambitions. The things that were never grand to begin with are still working, and the people who know how to use them are still standing. The ranger will not rebuild what fell. That was never the ranger's tradition. But the ranger can tell you which parts of the wreckage are still useful, and which parts are too corrupt to touch, and which path through the ruins keeps you alive long enough to find the next one. In Wraeclast, that knowledge is not a small thing. It is, in many ways, the most essential knowledge there is. Chapter 4. The Sorceress is, in the most straightforward terms, a scholar. Not a scholar in the contemporary sense of someone who has spent years in a library accumulating citations. A scholar in the older sense. The sense that predates modern institutional scholarship. A person who has devoted their life to the systematic pursuit of understanding. Who has placed that pursuit above most other commitments. Who has made the acquisition of knowledge the central organizing principle of their existence, in a way that most people, quite reasonably, find excessive. The sorceress arrived at Wraeclast with more knowledge of what she would find there than any other class, which is a significant advantage in some respects and a specific disadvantage in others, because knowledge of what something is can limit your capacity to encounter it as it actually presents itself. The magical tradition the sorceress comes from has roots that connect directly to the Eternal Empire's scholarly apparatus, which makes the sorceress, of all the classes, the one most deeply embedded in the intellectual history of Wraeclast's most recent major civilization, the Eternal Empire, for all its eventual catastrophic failures, produced an extraordinary body of knowledge about the fundamental forces that operate in this world. It produced this knowledge through methods that were not always ethical, through experiments that were not always conducted with the consent of the people involved, through a relationship to power that ultimately proved self-destructive. But the knowledge itself, separated from the circumstances of its production, is genuinely significant. The Sorceress carries some of that knowledge, in the form of a tradition of elemental magic that traces its formal development to Eternal Empire scholarship. The specific elements that the Sorceress works with, fire and cold and lightning, are not arbitrary. Each of them corresponds to a specific set of fundamental forces that the Eternal Empire identified and named and developed magical systems for working with. The naming matters, because in Path of Exile's world, naming something, and the correct register with the correct understanding behind it, is a form of access. The Eternal Empire's scholars did not simply observe that fire existed, and that it could be dangerous. They developed a comprehensive theoretical framework for what fire is at the level of fundamental forces, how it relates to the other elemental forces, what its properties can be extended or modified by, and how a trained practitioner can establish a working relationship with it that goes beyond simply producing it. The Sorceress is the inheritor of that framework, and the framework is what makes her power significantly different from someone who could just set things on fire. The exile that brought the Sorceress to Wraeclast is, in the game's framing, typically connected to the content of her scholarship, rather than to a specific act of violence or political inconvenience. The Sorceress's exile is intellectual exile, the exile of someone who pursued a line of inquiry that the institutions of knowledge found dangerous. This is a specific kind of exile, one with a long history and context, where institutions control access to information and use that control as a mechanism of power. The thing the Sorceress was investigating, or the conclusions she reached, or the applications she developed from those conclusions, came into conflict with the interests of the people who manage what is allowed to be known, and the appropriate response from those people's perspective was to remove her from the context in which she could continue developing her dangerous knowledge, and place her in a context where that development would presumably kill her before it produced anything further. The irony of this approach is one the game does not over-explain. Wraeclast is, if you want to learn about the things the Sorceress was studying, the best possible place to be. The ruins of the Eternal Empire are full of the research that the scholars who came before her were conducting. The corrupted spaces of Wraeclast are the living results of experiments that were sealed behind institutional walls when they were being conducted. The Sorceress, sent to Wraeclast as a punishment, has been sent to the most comprehensive available library on the subjects she was most interested in. The exile is, from the perspective of her scholarship, an opportunity. This does not mean she experiences it that way, at least not at first, but it is one of the game's quiet lore moves, placing the scholar in the place where the scholarship most urgently matters. The Sorceress's relationship to the Eternal Empire's history is complicated by the fact that the Empire, whose scholarship she inherits, is also the entity most directly responsible for some of what she will encounter in Wraeclast. The scholars who developed the elemental magic framework she uses were the same people, or the institutional ancestors of the same people, who were simultaneously developing the immortality research that eventually destabilized the world. The Sorceress's tradition is not innocent of the history it comes from. She carries within her training a specific intellectual orientation, a specific set of assumptions about what scholarship is for, and what it is appropriate to pursue, that the Eternal Empire developed, and that the Eternal Empire used to justify things that were not justifiable. The Sorceress's arc in the game involves, among other things, a reckoning with this inheritance. The specific forms of elemental magic available to the Sorceress have distinct lore implications that are worth attending to individually. Fire magic in Path of Exile 2's framework is not simply the production of flame. It is a relationship with a force that the game associates with transformation, with the destruction of one state in order to produce another. Fire in this world does not simply burn things. It changes their fundamental nature, and the sorceress who works with fire is working with a force that has a particular relationship to change, to the ending of what was and the forcible beginning of what comes next. The Eternal Empire's fire scholars were aware of this dimension of their work, and their awareness of it is preserved in the theoretical framework the sorceress inherits. Fire as transformation is a more interesting idea than fire as damage output, and the game's elemental magic system is built around the more interesting idea. Cold magic has a different relationship to the fundamental forces, one that the Eternal Empire scholars described in terms of stillness and potentiality. Cold in the framework is not simply the absence of heat. It is a state of reduced energetic activity that has specific consequences for the forces involved, including the consequence of making them easier to observe and understand precisely because they are less active. The sorceress who works with cold magic is working with a tool that, among its other applications, creates conditions for clarity, for the kind of precise observation that scholarship requires. There is a reason the Eternal Empire's most careful and exacting researchers tended toward cold magic in their experimental work. It suited the temperament of precision, and it produced results that were stable enough to study carefully rather than catastrophically immediate in a way that made study difficult. Lightning magic is the most volatile of the three elemental schools, and its lore reflects this. The Eternal Empire's lightning scholars were a specific kind of practitioner, one that combined intellectual rigor with a tolerance for unpredictability that the cold magic scholars sometimes found alarming. Lightning in Path of Exile's world is associated with speed and with a fundamental force that the game sometimes calls the spark of existence, the animating principle that distinguishes the living from the merely material. Lightning magic at its most sophisticated is not simply fast damage. It is an engagement with one of the deepest forces the Eternal Empire's scholars identified. A force that operates at the level where the material world and the metaphysical world are least distinguishable from each other. The sorceress who specializes in lightning is the sorceress who is willing to work closest to the places where the fundamental rules of the world's operation are most visible. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the sorceress's casting animations and notice that they suggest not just the production of elemental force, but the management of it. The sorceress does not simply throw fire. She positions the fire, directs it, shapes it with a precision that reflects the theoretical framework behind the casting. This is the game's visual language for the idea that elemental magic and the sorceress's tradition is not raw force production, but the application of a disciplined understanding of force. The Eternal Empire's scholars spent generations developing the theory that allows a practitioner to do this, rather than simply summoning force and hoping it goes where directed. The sorceress's casting animations are a record of that theoretical work, rendered in the body language of someone who has internalized it. The sorceress's ascendancy paths are the Stormweaver and the Chronomancer, and they represent the two most significant philosophical directions available within the elemental magic tradition. The Stormweaver takes the tradition's relationship to the fundamental forces and develops it in the direction of raw expression, of the elemental itself operating at scales that leave individual practitioners' physical protection as an almost irrelevant consideration. The Chronomancer takes the tradition in a different direction entirely, one that the Eternal Empire's most ambitious scholars explored, and that the institutional framework of that empire found deeply troubling. The Stormweaver's lore is built around the idea that the elemental forces, at sufficient scale, begin to demonstrate properties that are qualitatively different from the properties they show at moderate scale. A fire that is large enough is not just a larger version of a small fire. It becomes a self-sustaining system with its own dynamics. Dynamics that can be worked with, but that operate according to principles that require a different level of understanding than small-scale fire manipulation. The Stormweaver is the Sorceress, who has pushed her elemental engagement to the point where she is working with forces at the scale where those qualitative differences emerge, and the result is a form of power that looks, from the outside, like the raw elemental forces of the world operating through a human vessel, rather than a human managing the forces at arm's length. The Stormweaver's specific relationship to lightning is worth noting, because lightning at scale is the elemental phenomenon most directly connected to the fundamental animating forces the Eternal Empire identified. A Stormweaver who has fully developed their path is not simply producing a lot of lightning. They are engaging with the animating force directly, and the results of that engagement extend beyond simple damage to the surrounding environment. The specific ascendancy nodes that give the Stormweaver the capacity to create self-sustaining electrical phenomena, to generate storms within dungeons, to produce lightning that chains and propagates according to its own logic, rather than the practitioner's immediate direction. All of these are expressions of the game's lore argument that the Stormweaver has moved from practicing elemental magic to participating in elemental forces, at a level where the distinction between the practitioner and the practice has become functionally meaningless. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Stormweaver's most advanced nodes, and notice that they reference the effects of lightning on consciousness. This is not simply a narrative embellishment. It points toward the Eternal Empire's theoretical framework for lightning magic, which included the observation that lightning's relationship to the animating force meant that lightning effects at scale had the capacity to affect the same systems and living beings that the animating force normally governs. This is in the game's vocabulary. The beginning of the territory that the Eternal Empire found troubling about the lightning scholars. The place where lightning magic stops being a tool for projecting force and starts being something that engages with the fundamental nature of living things in ways that raise ethical questions the institutional framework was not designed to answer. The Chronomancer is where the Sorceress's lore becomes most directly entangled with the Eternal Empire's most forbidden research. The manipulation of time is not simply a magical technique in Path of Exile's world. It is an engagement with the fundamental structure of the world's operation, in a way that the Eternal Empire identified very early as extraordinarily dangerous and very nearly prohibited entirely. The fact that it is available as an ascendancy path in Path of Exile 2 is itself a piece of lore. Something that was forbidden has become possible again, either because the prohibition lapsed or because the current state of the world has removed the institutional framework that enforced it. Time manipulation in the Eternal Empire's theoretical framework is connected to the same forces that the immortality research engaged with. Both involve the relationship between consciousness and temporal continuity, and both, at sufficient depth of engagement, begin to affect that relationship in ways that are not straightforwardly reversible. The Eternal Empire's prohibition on temporal manipulation was not a simple institutional overcaution. It was based on specific observed results in specific experiments. Practitioners who interfered with the temporal structure of events began to develop a relationship to time that differed from ordinary temporal experience. And that difference, once established, did not always stay within the practitioner's control. The Chronomancer's abilities in Path of Exile 2 include skills that slow time for enemies, skills that accelerate the Sorceress's own temporal experience, and skills that create temporal anomalies in areas of the game world. Each of these is an expression of the theoretical framework, but the theoretical framework was very clear about one thing. Temporal manipulation at the level required to produce these effects is not simply the application of power. It is the development of a specific relationship to the fabric of time itself. And that relationship, once established, changes the practitioner in ways that extend beyond their moment of active casting. The Chronomancer is not someone who turns on temporal manipulation and then turns it off. The Chronomancer is someone who has become, in a real sense, differently situated in time than ordinary beings are. The Eternal Empire's records of its temporal research, accessible through item descriptions and specific NPC dialogue in Path of Exile, suggests that the practitioners who went furthest with temporal manipulation eventually reached a point where their relationship to their own past and future became genuinely complicated, not simply a metaphor for the disorientation that profound intellectual engagement sometimes produces. A functional alteration of how they experienced temporal sequence, one that made conventional social and practical existence difficult in ways that had nothing to do with their combat effectiveness. The Chronomancer's arc, in the context of Path of Exile 2's story, involves developing this relationship and discovering what it ultimately means to be differently situated in time, in a world that is itself operating on multiple temporal layers simultaneously. The Sorceress's relationship to the other classes reflects her scholarly formation in specific ways. The Sorceress tends to analyze rather than react. When she encounters something, her first impulse is to understand it, to identify which part of her theoretical framework it belongs to, and what that framework tells her about how to engage with it. This is often very effective, because her framework is genuinely powerful and comprehensive. It is less effective in situations where the thing she is encountering does not fit any existing framework, and Wraeclast is full of those situations. The Sorceress's arc involves multiple encounters with things that do not fit, and her response to those encounters, whether she forces them into existing categories or allows herself to be changed by the encounter, is one of the class's central lore threads. The Sorceress's relationship to the monk is particularly interesting because both classes have a sophisticated engagement with the world's fundamental forces, but from completely different directions. The Sorceress approaches those forces through a theoretical framework developed by scholars who are trying to understand and control them. The monk approaches them through a practice tradition that seeks alignment rather than control. These are not compatible approaches. They produce different results, make different errors, and produce different kinds of practitioners. When the Sorceress and the monk occupy the same space in the game's narrative, the game creates a quiet dialogue between two entirely different ways of knowing the world's deepest forces, and neither side of that dialogue is presented as simply correct. The question of what it costs to be a sorceress, in the sense that this script has been asking about each class, is answered in the sorceress's specific vulnerability, the physical fragility that her investment in elemental mastery produces. The sorceress who has devoted herself entirely to the theoretical and practical development of elemental power is a sorceress who has not devoted herself to the physical resilience that the warrior or the monk cultivates. This is not simply a mechanical balance consideration. It is a lore statement about what complete investment in one domain means for investment in others. The sorceress's body is, in a real sense, a secondary concern to a practitioner whose primary concern is the development and application of understanding. This is not comfortable, but it is honest, and the sorceress's power at its highest development is commensurate with the risk it requires her to carry. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the sorceress's passive skill tree and notice that the paths toward the greatest elemental damage output pass through regions that also carry increased vulnerabilities. This is the game's lore argument rendered mechanically. The scholar's path, followed far enough, takes you through places where your previous certainties become less stable. The sorceress who has pushed furthest into fire magic is the sorceress who has gone deep enough into the nature of transformation to understand that transformation does not respect the boundaries you place around it. The Stormweaver who has gone deepest into the animating force of lightning is the Stormweaver who has engaged most directly with the forces that could, in principle, animate her differently than she was animated before. The knowledge of what can be done is also the knowledge of what can be done to you. The Sorceress's most important piece of the larger lore is the question she asks that the other classes mostly do not. What actually happened? Not what to do about it. What happened? The warrior wants to know who to fight. The ranger wants to know the terrain. The sorceress wants to understand the sequence of events, the theoretical framework of causes, the structure of what unfolded and why. In Wraeclast's context, this question is never fully answerable, but the sorceress's pursuit of it produces information that the other classes benefit from, without always understanding how it was obtained. The Chronomancer, by the end of their development, may be the class that has the deepest access to the actual history of what happened in Wraeclast. Not through records or scholarship, but through a direct relationship to the temporal fabric of the world that makes the distinction between past events and present experience less absolute than it is for other people. What the Chronomancer does with that access, and whether the access changes who they are in ways that complicate its value, is the question the game asks through this ascendancy path without fully answering it. The answer, like most of the best things in Path of Exile's lore, lives in the gap between what the game tells you and what you construct from it. The Sorceress and Exile are connected through the specific mechanism of intellectual threat. You exile a scholar not because you fear what they can do with their hands, but because you fear what they can do with what they know. The Sorceress's exile is an admission of intellectual power by the people who sent her away, even if they would not frame it that way. They recognized that what she knew or was pursuing was dangerous to their interests, and their response was to remove her from the context in which she could act on that knowledge. The irony, repeated from an angle slightly different from the one noted earlier, is that removing her to Wraeclast placed her in the context most saturated with the evidence she needed to develop that knowledge further. The exile meant to contain her scholarship ended up completing it. What the Sorceress's arc ultimately says about Path of Exile 2 is something about the nature of understanding in a world that rewards it dangerously. The game does not celebrate knowledge without consequences. The Eternal Empire's pursuit of understanding ended in catastrophe. The Sorceress's tradition is inherited from people who made those catastrophes possible. The game holds this history present throughout the Sorceress's development, using item descriptions and NPC reactions, and the specific nature of what her power produces to ensure that the scholar's triumph never feels entirely clean. This is not a moralistic statement. It is a lore statement. In this world, the connection between knowledge and its costs is not incidental. It is structural. And the Sorceress, more than any other class, embodies both the value and the price of that structural truth. The final development of the Sorceress, whether through the Stormweaver's elemental expression or the Chronomancer's temporal engagement, is a version of power that would have been recognized as dangerous by the Eternal Empire's institutional framework. Not because it is evil or corrupted in the moral sense, but because it has reached a scale and a depth that the institutions were designed to prevent. The institutions are gone now. The prohibitions they enforced are historical footnotes. The Sorceress and Wraeclast can go further than the Eternal Empire permitted in what she finds there. Whether it is the deep structure of the world's elemental forces or the fabric of time itself is genuinely what the scholarship was always pursuing. The question the game leaves open is whether getting what the scholarship was always pursuing is actually what the Sorceress wanted. That question, sitting in the space between the Sorceress's theoretical power and the experienced reality of having it, is one of the most thoughtful things Path of Exile 2 does with its class lore. The scholar who gets what she was looking for and discovers that what she was looking for was not quite what she thought it was, that is not a cautionary tale in the simple sense. It is something closer to the honest shape of what deep pursuit of understanding actually produces. The Sorceress, at the end of her arc, knows more than she knew at the beginning. Whether that knowledge resolves anything or simply opens onto the next set of questions is for the player to decide. Path of Exile 2 trusts that its players can sit with that kind of openness. The lore of the Sorceress rewards them for doing so,